I heard a fair one cry. But give to me the snoring breeze, and white waves heaving high. And white waves heaving high, my lads, the good ship's tight and free. The world of waters is our home, and merry men are we.
Offering 095, midships, port 10, manage and head 12 knots.
Manage head 12 knots, 12 knots mid centre.
Steer 095.
Hard right.
Starboard 30, altering 110.
RAN, the Royal Australian Navy. All navies are ships and sailors, but this one is different.
Starboard centre, 065,
The RAN is built on a hard tradition. Centuries of tradition inherited from the Royal Navy, and 75 years of tradition in being Australia's own navy, built in peace and war.
Officer Captain for the Yeoman, past to Canberra. Join me, formation Yankee.
Yes, you're right.
Starboard, course 090, speed 15, distance about 4,000 yards.
Increase 15. Revolutions 121.
Revolutions 121.
Since the days of Captain Cook, Australian waters had always been protected by the Royal Navy. With Federation in 1901, however, the new Australian nation increasingly felt the need for its own navy. After years of discussion, the RAN was eventually designated the Royal Australian Navy in 1911. And in October of that year, its first fleet, which had been built in Britain, sailed through Sydney Heads. This, at last, was tangible evidence of a new nation's growing pride.
The first Australian Fleet Unit, as it was called, arrived in Sydney on the 4th of October 1913. I was only a young lad then, and my father took me down to Man o' War Steps to see the spectacle. It was quite a sight. The Australia was the leading ship, the flagship Australia, and she was followed in by the Melbourne and the Sydney. Like most young boys, of course, I was very excited to see this wonderful sight.
Today, RAN new entry recruits are trained at HMAS Cerberus, south of Melbourne. This can be a bewildering time. 11 weeks of learning and readjustment, 11 weeks of trying to forget you were ever a civilian and discovering that Navy does things Navy's way.
I'm not calling the step out for the sake of calling it out.
Here, you do as you're told, men and women together. The same arduous routines, the same slog, the same sense of pride, learning to be sailors. First, you must get fit, very fit, and learn to take an order.
With this nice even awning, it doesn't matter how much tension you can put on it. You get rain on it, it's going to bulge and it's going to sag. Quartermaster's going to get his head wet. So what we do there is we slope it. So your awning then comes over and slopes down, right? And that'll allow the water to run off naturally.
In 1912, all new recruits went straight on board ship, though it never sailed anywhere. HMAS Tingara was moored permanently in Sydney's Rose Bay. The tinny boys, almost straight from their mother's arms, learned swiftly that even a few feet of water could make the difference between civilian and military.
The boys all slept in hammocks together on what was known as the sleeping deck. 5:30 in the morning, the bugle sounded the reveille, and all the boys were turned out of their hammocks, and if they weren't quick enough getting out, they were tipped out by the petty officers' instructors. Within half an hour, they had to be up on the mess deck, where they were supplied with a steaming hot bowl of cocoa and a hard sea biscuit. At 6 o'clock, assembly was sounded, and all the boys mustered by divisions on the upper deck. There were 200 boys approximately on board at any one time. They were divided into 4 divisions of 50. Then cleaning the ship took place. Boys were allocated to cleaning the mess decks, the boats, but the majority of them scrubbed the decks. And this was achieved by pumping seawater from the harbour and long-handle scrubbers. Occasionally this was varied by that wonderful exercise known as holy stoning. And this was to remove the dead wood from the decks, and it consisted of rubbing 2 stones, one in each hand, together backwards and forwards in a kneeling position. Wasn't the best of chores on a winter's morning.
It was a hard life. Looking back, it was a hard life because when you're young, you don't notice these things. But it was hard, and the food wasn't Hotel Australia style. It was come and get it, and if you happened to be last, you didn't get any. If you happened to be on watch or something like that, and came down, after it was all over, you had to wait till the next meal.
The RAN went to war just a few short years after its formation. This was the Great War, and the Navy's first task was to escort the first AIF across the world to a beach landing at Gallipoli. 38 transports carrying the Anzacs set off for war, escorted by British, Japanese and Australian warships. There were fears that German warships were in the convoy's path, and as it crossed the Indian Ocean, a German raider Emden was discovered near the Cocos Islands. HMAS Sydney was dispatched at full steaming speed to deal with this potentially disastrous threat.
Emden was a German maritime raider which had set up a tremendous record of destroying maritime resources around the Indian Ocean.
Emden was sighted, and Sydney's Captain Glossop closed to within 9,500 yards and commenced fire. Emden had the range, however, and Sydney took hits. Though valiant, the Germans were outgunned, and Sydney charged on. Shells smashed Emden's steering gear, her wireless station, and shot away both her rangefinders. The forward funnel collapsed overboard, and Emden was gravely wounded. Her captain, von Muller, ran her aground to continue the fight. Still, Sydney fired. By late in the day, it was all over. Emden was defeated, and the RAN had been blooded. Emden's crew had displayed great bravery and earned the respect of the weary Australians.
You see, I jumped overboard in the morning, and by the time it got evening, and nobody of the Sydney knew that I was ashore, a thirsty man. And then I rowed out to the Sydney. I saw only some lights there. I still remember the moon was shining, and finally I reached the Sydney. And when I stepped on the ladder, somebody came down with a big lamp and was searching me for arms, and I couldn't help laughing and said, well, you see, I have nothing on, I'm quite naked. How shall I have my arms? And then somebody, come on, boy. Then I stepped aboard, and then there was a very stout Australian sailor and said, come on, boy, here, have a mug of tea here.
The young RAN had just 2 submarines, AE-1 and AE-2. The first was lost with all hands off New Guinea. The second, AE-2, was to be given one of the most dangerous tasks ever allocated to an RAN ship. She was ordered by the British Fleet Commander, Admiral de Robeck, to penetrate the Dardanelles to the Sea of Marmora and interfere with enemy maritime traffic moving in support of the defending Turkish forces. Furthermore, she was to run amok generally.
AE-2 was responsible for one of the finest feats of the Australian Navy in the First World War. It was assigned the task of penetrating the Dardanelles on the first Anzac Day, that is to say the 25th of April, 1915. The purpose was to get into the Dardanelles and create havoc behind the lines at the time that the diggers were going ashore at Gallipoli.
AE-2 not only penetrated the Dardanelles, she ran amok for 5 full days, firing her torpedoes at a variety of targets and being chased all over the Sea of Marmora. On the 30th of April, she was sunk. Her crew of 3 officers and 17 men survived to become prisoners.
Roger, I believe shot 2 clips, 2 pins.
Uplink shot 2 clips, 1 pin.
Thanks, forward.
That's forward.
Uplink shot 2 clips, 1 pin, sir.
Bring the Arthur and Gate Tower intermediate.
I'm standing in the forward part of the submarine at the present time. This is the fore ends. It contains 6 torpedo tubes and racks for reload torpedoes. As you can see, in peacetime we also fit bunks to these racks so we can carry extra trainees. This is the forward mess where 22 junior sailors eat and sleep. As you see, it's quite a small area. Back here we've got more bunks. We fit them into every conceivable spot on the submarine. In here, excuse me, T.I., this is the senior sailors mess, where 15 senior sailors also eat and sleep.
Well, Ray's always on deck.
As we move further aft, we come to a rather important area of the submarine, the galley. This galley produces at least 3 meals a day for a ship's company of approximately 73 people. We're now moving into the centre of the submarine, and back here we have the officers' living quarters, the wardroom, where 7 officers eat and sleep. And at the back of the wardroom, we have the control room. This is really the heart of the submarine, where we have the submarine fire control system that controls the weapons, the sonar which detects our targets, our navigational plots which keep us safe, and our ship control surfaces over on the port side.
Ready, Billy? Okay.
Must realise that we're only at the moment halfway through the submarine. There is another half to go, and that contains diesel generators, conversion machinery, and a rather small after mess for junior sailors.
Well, when we go to sea, sometimes we go into 2 watches, which is 6 hours on, 6 hours off, which you don't normally get a lot of sleep in that 6 hours off because you're doing action stations and evolutions in between that. So you just got to sort of grab as much sleep as you can. And we have to put up with a fair whack of things at sea. We have to conserve water so we can't use it a lot. Well, we can't have showers every day. We can only bird bath, so we might shower once a week if we're lucky. But, we don't hot bunk it anymore. One jumps out and one jumps in. We've each got our own room. But, I think the major thing is crampness and the smell.
This will be 2, this one. Get most of it done now because this afternoon we're supposed to prepare desserts as well.
and consequently we've got to get most of our work done now, because it's we don't have time otherwise, and you don't know what the captain's going to do here. Although the captain normally, or the XO, will tell us if he's going to do any evolutions. Consequently, we know what we can do in here. Beautiful. Very nice.
Some blokes tend to get a little bit on each other's nerves sometimes, but we have to sort our own problems out while we're at sea.
Big mountain of lobsters there and the crays and stuff. He's bloody hungry.
But the morale is usually fairly good because we all sort of stick together in our individual messes, sort of closer knit than on general service.
Between the wars, a naval armaments race had developed between the United States, Britain and Japan. To cool things down, a conference held in November 1921 decided that naval fleets should be limited. Included as part of the British Empire quota, the RAN was forced to accept a reduction. The mighty Australia was to be scrapped, scuttled off Sydney Heads.
At the time of the actual scuttling, we were about 300 or 400 yards off the ship, laying 30 miles off Sydney Heads, in what's become known as the graveyard. And it was a very traumatic moment, particularly for those who had served on the Australia previously, but we didn't know what it was all about at the time. We since learned, of course, why this had to happen. But it was a very dramatic moment as the charges went off, the sea cocks were opened, the scuttling party left the ship in a pinnace to go back to the HMAS Brisbane, and finally the old ship turned turtle and went down stern first.
While all RAN officer recruits receive their academic training at the Defence Force Academy in Canberra, it's here at HMAS Creswell in Jervis Bay that they learn what Navy is all about. Again, discipline is what turns young civilians into dedicated naval officers.
We joined Jervis Bay at 13, and trying to keep up with the older boys at 13 was a bit of a strain in many ways. We fortunately, on arrival, we were the only ones, because we were the new boys and had to be kitted up. But we had a very good introduction, really, on the first night at our supper. Somebody dipped into the honey and brought out a mouse, and the rest of us were occupied knocking the weevils out of the biscuits. And God knows how old they were, but that's quite true. But thereafter, I think we fitted in fairly well. When it blew, the walls of the study blocks used to move, and the corticine, that is the linoleum on the floors of our living blocks, used to lift about a foot, but that was all part of the game, I suppose, to get us ready for sea.
Here at the college, discipline is supposed to worry you in a little way, in the fact that it's that initial shock that sort of brings you into line. The initial onslaught, when you first arrive, it just becomes almost unreasonable. You just sort of say, what's all this about? You know, I'm leaving, this is it, taking the next bus. But it takes a while before you start to see where everybody falls into place and how you're going to respond in the future job. Here I'm still training, but I can see how I think it's going to work in the future, where that's going to become sort of part of my job.
On the whole, we enjoyed Jervis Bay. We saw the fleet. We actually went to sea in it a couple of times. And I think that was a great thing as far as the young were concerned. They could see what they were aiming for.
This is my third year here. At the end of this year, I'll pass out from the college. I'll do 3 months further training through the establishments, just non-academic, professional-wise. and then hit the big ships.
Before that, of course, one must learn to be a gentleman. The formal mess dinner is far more than a meal. Traditions passed down from the days of sail and inherited by the RAN must be adhered to. Which knife and fork to use, never to raise the port decanter, and the correct order of the toast.
Mr. Vice, the Queen.
Gentlemen, the Queen. The Queen.
(1939). Once more, Australians went to war. Once more, the AIF sailed for foreign shores, and once more, the RAN was to see them there safely. In early 1940, a convoy of 11 fast liners carrying 13,500 Australian and New Zealand troops was escorted to the Middle East. In the Mediterranean, the British fleet was coming up against a formidable Italian fleet. This was to be one of the major naval battlegrounds of the Second War, and the British appeared to be outgunned.
After the defeat of France, the Italian Navy came into the war with the Italians, and they had a very large and pretty efficient sort of a fleet. By comparison, the Royal Navy was very weak. Admiral Cunningham, who was a fine and resourceful commander, had only 3 cruisers and 5 pretty old Australian destroyers, which became famous as the Scrap Iron Flotilla. The Royal Navy sent reinforcements to help Cunningham. One of them was HMAS Sydney, commanded by Captain Collins, and the other HMAS Hobart.
The Australians were soon in action alongside the Royal Navy at the Battle of Calabria. Then, on the 19th of July, HMAS Sydney came upon the Italian cruisers Giovanni del Bandiniera and the Bartolomeo Colleoni. Sydney's Captain Collins had lured the Italians into a deadly trap.
I was a leading seaman gunner at the time, and my job was to open the breech so that they could ram the shells in and arm the breech with the igniter cap, and then close it and make it ready for the next round when that was fired. And I don't know who got the greatest shot, the British destroyers or the Italian cruisers. On our third salvo, we scored a hit on the Italian flagship, the Giovanni del Bandiniera, which caused some consternation to the Italians because the edict in the Italian Navy in those days, put out by Mussolini and his people, was that at all costs the Italians had to protect their ships, and if it meant turning away and fighting another day, that was what they did. So having scored that hit on the flagship, the Italian flagship, that sort of altered the course of the action. The Italians turned away and started to run.
The chase was on, with the Italians some 16 kilometers ahead of the Australians. The Colleoni in the rear became the main target. Fire was continued on the 2 cruisers until a shell from Sydney exploded in the Colleoni's boiler room, stopping the ship. 545 Italian sailors were captured, and the Bartolomeo Colleoni sunk.
The loss of the Bartolomeo Colleoni was a sharp reverse for the Italians, the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean, and Mussolini was reported to be very gloomy at the result of the combat. It was not so much because they'd lost a ship, but because he felt that the Italians hadn't fought very well or brilliantly in that action. After that, the Italians tended to keep within the harbour, in spite of the very strong patrolling by British and Australian ships. Because they kept in harbour, Cunningham decided to go after them, and he hit them at Taranto, And Taranto, the results of that was amounted to a major strategic victory, naval victory in the Mediterranean.
Collins and his jubilant crew were justifiably proud. It was one bright spot in an otherwise gloomy period of the war. The AIF 6th Division, after their victories against the Italians in North Africa, were sent against the Germans in Greece. It was an ill-conceived campaign from the start, and the Australians were soon in full retreat, the Navy their only hope. Most of the troops were evacuated to the island of Crete, but once again, retreat was inevitable.
I'd been for just on a week with no food and no sleep. You're just virtually exhausted by this time. And we'd lost faith with our own officers, but we knew the Navy. I mean, if it was into the Navy, we knew that we were pretty right. I mean, like, they had this experience, and I mean, they had the knowledge and this sort of thing, so we weren't worried too much. The whole thing was to get away from them. It was the middle of the night, something 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, something like that. You know, waiting on Kalamata Beach, when suddenly out of the gloom and doom came this voice from a naval officer. I am a naval officer, and I am in charge of this beach, in very crisp, what would you say, no nonsense voice. And he had that beach under control in a matter of minutes.
The Navy ran a desperate shuttle service between Crete and North Africa. Though the troops were picked up under cover of dark, the dawn would bring the inevitable air attacks as the ships made their run for safety. The Australian destroyer HMAS Napier was to make one of the last runs into Crete.
I've never forgotten this one. We passed the other team coming out, cruisers, and amongst it was the Australian destroyer Stuart. She tried to come with us, but they said no, she was to stay with that team, and they told us later they never expected to see us again. Thank goodness we didn't know it, but we went on, and luckily that night, where there were some landing craft left behind by those people, and we were able to get on board approximately 1,700 people in the 2 destroyers this time. We shot off, and very shortly after 9 o'clock we were heavily bombed. In Napier we were brought to a standstill and eventually got away again, but we finally had to be towed through the breakwater at Alexandria.
Across the Mediterranean, the Australian 9th Division, the Rats of Tobruk, had been holding out against vastly superior German and Italian forces. Their backs to the sea, they endured month after month of attacks. Ammunition, food and water always in short supply. It was up to the Navy to carry in all supplies and evacuate the wounded. The famed Tobruk ferry run became one of the most hazardous tasks undertaken in the Mediterranean. Altogether, Australian destroyers made 139 runs into Tobruk, and several ships were lost.
To get into Tobruk, you had to pick up the oil lights of a sunken trawler. They'd been taken out and put up as lead lights, and they were very hard to find. Having got them, you then got inside, weaved your way through the wrecks, and went to wherever you'd been asked to berth. And the idea was to try and beat every other destroyer in the time taken to get discharge approximately 90 tons of cargo. I think we won it hands down in Nizam. But once we got out, we used to pour on the speed and get away as fast as we could, because it was felt that that was owed to the wounded who were coming on board, and it eventually, of course, to the fact that the division was being relieved, and we used to take up their reliefs and bring out the 9th Division.
From all over Australia, young men are traveling to join the crew of the HMAS Cerberus, the ship that never goes to sea. Any day now, the German Admiralty may be expected to announce they've sunk her. HMAS Cerberus is the Navy's name for Flinders Naval Depot, where youth is trained to take its place in Australia's young fleet. A fleet barely 30 years old, but already rich in tradition, with the stars of many victories emblazoned on its battle flag. the Emden, Bartolomeo Colleone, the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and victories yet to come.
Boots heavy, boots light, shoes gymnastics, shoes white canvas, one collar blue jeans, brush shaving, brush blacking, brush polishing, brush clothes, brush hair, brush too.
They haven't overlooked a thing. It's a way they have in the Navy. And there's the bugle. From now on, it governs their lives. It's the bugle to get up. Goodbye to feather bed.
Ah.
Did I know that? Big sprint, start the pole. Keep it going all the way down, close as you can. Catch up, win. There.
Come on, this one over here, quick. Hey, 6 feet in front of me.
1D, catch her up. You can do it. Last move all the way down.
Sit down. Get up. Sit down. Sit up.
A lot of my friends just thought I was mad for going in. They couldn't understand that it was what I wanted. They were just looking at it from their point of view.
If you do the right thing, you don't get yelled at, obviously. You know, it's just a matter of just sort of taking what they say. You've got to take it.
When I first got here, all I wanted to do was go home. First night I was really homesick, and all I wanted to do was go home. And then when you settle in and you get used to the life and used to the people and the instructors, you sort of settle down and you feel a lot better and then start getting on with what's most important to you.
You've been in the same class, so you should have things folded the same way. I.e., have a look at his underpants, have a look at your underpants. Different folding, right? Let's pick out a white trunk. What's that? Dirt PO.
Dirt PO.
Grind, rubbish, muck.
If you don't take it, you get in more trouble, you know. You can't just turn around and tell them off because it's just not on. You got to sort of switch off really for about 12 weeks until you get through here.
Discipline, the underlying keynote of all their training. But it's a democratic discipline that the men understand and appreciate. No matter what branch of the Navy they join, their first training is in seamanship. They join the Navy to see the world. And what'll they see? Well, they'll see the sea. And they're glad of it. In cutters and whalers, the veriest landlubber soon feels he's the ancient mariner himself.
Keep moving. Yeah. We'll stand by to tackle. Ready for it? Lead it off there, please. Leo.
We all pull together when we need to. We did a survival at sea, and there was a lot of the girls who really panicked when they first hit the water, and the guys were fantastic. They just, you know, really helped, and we all just stuck together, and now they just treat us as one of the boys. And we get on really well now.
To your front, 8 target will appear. Watch and shoot.
I think probably the way women's equal rights are going, that we probably will end up in combat roles.
Today, women are almost completely integrated into Navy life. All basic training assumes no bias as to sex.
Just watch your telly band, it's just starting to slip down.
You
Bring
see?
it up above the rim of your cap there.
You see?
Yeah, just tighten it a bit.
I joined the Navy because I know that they need people like us. I mean, maybe we don't go on board ship right now, but while the men are away, somebody has to look after the shore establishments, and that's the main reason why I joined.
Two RAN ships, HMAS Jarvis Bay and the survey ship HMAS Cook, have female crew members.
It's not a 8 till 4 job. It's all around the clock, the whole 24 hours.
Whiskey 2, this is Juliet 2, over.
Roger. Bow thrust close up, sir.
Whiskey 2, this is Juliet 2. Execute to follow. Corpin for par. 270, tack, speed 10, over.
It's not like I thought it'd be, but I still love it. It's completely different to anything you know. Now you know why when the guys come off the ships and come onto a land base, they say, oh, the girls get it so easy. Well, now we know why, because at sea you're always working.
Whiskey 2, this is Juliet 2, Roger, out.
By 1941, the RAN had 68 ships in commission, and its 20,000 sailors were stretched to the limit. The Women's Royal Australian Naval Service was formed to relieve men for active duty.
We have the fondest memory of working with the men and the men whom we relieved. But they were keen to get to sea. It was wartime, and they had no desire to spend it in a shore depot. And the men even got to the stage where they could recognise the individual Rans Morse. And, you know, we kept in touch with them over those war years. And the thing that stood out in my mind was when HMAS Sydney was lost. There was, you know, nothing was heard, and every girl, I'm sure, wondered, did I miss the message?
In February 1941, HMAS Sydney had returned to Australian waters from her victorious tour of duty in the Mediterranean. She was greeted by politicians and the public alike as a conquering hero. Captain Collins was relieved by Captain Burnett, and Sydney sailed into the Indian Ocean. Tragically, these men and their gallant ship were never seen again. Sydney was lost with all hands in mysterious circumstances.
I still can't believe that that happened to my ship. My friends, my colleagues, the men that I drank with and fought with in the Mediterranean, that they all went like that. I just can't bring myself to accept it as a person who served in that ship.
Sydney had encountered the heavily armed and disguised German raider Cormoran. In circumstances yet to be fully explained, both ships were sunk, Sydney with all her men.
The German raider Cormoran was under false Dutch colours, and Sydney approached fairly closely to within about 2 kilometres. No doubt because the ship was not was disguised as a friendly ship. Suddenly Cormoran dropped its disguise and opened a devastating fire, and the ensuing battle, a very savage battle, both ships were crippled and eventually sunk.
315 of Cormoran's 393 crew survived the engagement and were rescued. The discovery of these survivors set off a frantic search for Sydney's crew. None were ever found.
There was a tragic irony in the fact that Sydney had served through months of arduous operations in the Mediterranean and had not suffered one casualty. But in the fight with Cormoran, in stark contrast, not one man survived.
HMAS Sydney's loss was a devastating blow to Australia. It was to be the first of many to come, for now the war was drawing closer to home. On December the 7th, 1941, Japan entered the war and struck south. Suddenly, Australia looked imperiled. HMAS Perth was sunk in the Sunda Strait, and the Japanese looked invincible. Then, a combined American and Australian force turned them back in the Coral Sea. While this was mainly an aerial battle between American and Japanese carriers, RAN ships played a major diversionary role. And for many young sailors, it would be their first taste of action.
The captain came to the public address system from the bridge and announced augmented damage control parties close up. Okay, I'd never heard of such a call or an instruction coming to a ship. I was brand new. Asked the fellow alongside me, what does augmented damage control parties close up mean? Well, the skipper expects trouble, and he wants more people down below to close off bulkheads, to get rid of what water is going to be forced into the ship through torpedoes or bombs. My God, I'm suddenly at war.
This was a time of fast-moving and momentous events. In June, the Japanese attacked Sydney Harbour with midget submarines. An HMAS Cuttable, a converted ferry, was sunk.
It wasn't until 11:30, we were still on the upper deck of the old Cuttable, that she was hit by one of the torpedoes.
When it was realised that enemy submarines were in the harbour, all hell broke loose. American and Australian warships firing at will. Amid the confusion, one of the submarines was able to fire her torpedoes.
One went ashore up in the gun mounting store, the wharf, gun mounting wharf, and the second one went under K9, and Dutch submarine was moored alongside us, and hit the stone wall and just blew the bottom out of the Cuttable. She sunk in, I think a couple of minutes. I just went over the side, and that was the safest place to go, I thought.
19 sailors sleeping aboard Cuttable were killed. Suddenly, the war was very close to home indeed.
I'd been at sea on Canberra and over the UK, and I never thought I'd get torpedoed in Sydney Harbour.
It's thought that 3 midget submarines entered the harbour. One was entangled in boom wires near Watson's Bay and destroyed herself. Another was discovered in Taylor Bay and depth-charged. She was found the next morning, her engines still running, and her crew dead from self-inflicted wounds. The third was never found. In August 1942, HMAS Canberra, operating with the Americans in the Solomons, was attacked and damaged beyond repair by the Japanese.
Farewell, Canberra. Today she sails no more. Never again will her bows cut through the southern waters of the Australian Bight, or navigate the coral reefs of our northern coastline. Although Canberra's duties did not lead her into the Mediterranean zone, the AIF will remember her on escort for their fast convoys to the Middle East. Day and night, year in, year out, her men did their duty. Captain Getting, seen on right, remained at his post, in spite of mortal wounds.
During the action, an 8-inch shell came in the port side, landed in the shell handling room underneath us above the magazine. Unfortunately for us, it was made in Japan. Otherwise, it would have been the end of the lot of us.
Canberra has gone, but Canberra shall not die. Another shall arise.
Really, you think you're working a sort of a normal job, well, not so much when you're at sea, but a normal job when you're ashore of establishment. When you get back to sea and start doing the exercises, especially when you go on deployment and work with the Americans, you realise then what it's all about.
No smoking on the upper deck, no gas to be ditched, all personnel not involved in the helo transfer, clear off the quarter deck, bound 52 deck, port and starboard side 1 deck, aft, helo transfer in progress.
Some guys just seem to think, I'm in the Navy. A lot of guys say, I only do it as a job. I hate the Navy 23 hours a day. 1 hour they think it's okay. But when it comes to the crunch, the ship pride and spirit comes from.
Spraying restrictions lifted, 51 small arms magazines closed.
I've been in the Navy for 23 years, and it's what I've always set as my pinnacle to achieve, to have command of an operational destroyer or frigate. And this is it, and I reckon that it's one of the best jobs in Australia.
Life on board even the larger warships can be unpleasant and cramped. The intimate conditions, though, and a long tradition, create a special brotherhood.
It's pretty hard to try and explain. You go to parties with your mates and things like that, they ask you what you do, and you've got to try and bring it back to their terms. They ask what it's like, and there's nothing you can equate it with anywhere else. It is very different. It's strange, you can be with 300 people for 3 weeks and still be the loneliest bloke in the world. And that happens a lot. Especially with young kids, young married kids as well. They feel it, but they've just got to be able to accept it. It's like anything. If you can accept it and learn to live with it, fine, there's a system there to help you out. Sometimes it seems to work for you, sometimes it works against you. Sailors are pretty narky. They can get nasty, and it just goes, and if the worst comes to worst, it's squashed straight away. If someone doesn't fit, he soon finds out. So he either tries and fits in himself, and if he does, then sure, he's there, he's accepted.
October 1944. At last, General MacArthur was returning to his beloved Philippines. His invasion force was the largest ever assembled. 550 ships, including RAN forces, arrived off Leyte Island and commenced a heavy bombardment. The Japanese were to take up the challenge. The battle for Leyte Gulf had begun. This time, the Japanese were desperate, and they launched suicide attacks. Kamikaze. Little could be done to stop a pilot determined to crash his plane into a ship and end his life.
The unnerving thing was that you could follow that aircraft in until he emerged in the ground echo, and he was probably 300 yards away then. If they hadn't stopped him by the time he was 300 yards away, he was going to hit someone. So I was well aware of where he was, and I still couldn't see him, but I knew he was going to hit on the port side. And that was quite traumatic too. It was quite unnerving that there was nothing more you could do. You'd done all you could do, and then he was still coming in, and you waited for the close-range weapons to open up, and when they stopped, he was too close for them to bear on. And the next thing was the crunch, the big hit.
The new HMAS Australia suffered kamikaze hits, and 30 men were killed, including Captain Duchesneau and Commander Raymond. Commodore Collins was seriously wounded. Australia was hit several more times over the course of the battle, and was eventually withdrawn. By July 1945, the war was drawing to a close. Borneo was to be the scene of the last amphibious assault of World War II. At last, the RAN was in direct support of Australian troops.
The excitement was there for those mainly on the upper deck who were able to watch the activity, in that here for the first time we were able to support our own Australian Army.
Successful amphibious operations are among the most difficult of all military maneuvers. Even today, with the advantages of helicopter flights, landing a large force of men on a potentially hostile shore is a complicated operation requiring detailed logistical cooperation between the Air Force, Army and Navy.
Sergeant Laura is doing ammunition for the RSF.
All force personnel prepare for disembarkation.
Yes.
HMAS Tobruk is designed to go where the action is. She can carry and land assault troops and their supporting artillery and vehicles wherever she so chooses.
Essentially, we're a troop carrier. We carry troops and their supporting equipment. Situation we're in at the moment, we're carrying troops which are about to be landed in the next 12 hours, We've been going through a rehearsal phase this morning, and later this afternoon we actually start flying off the troops and their supporting arms. That's their guns, 105mm howitzers and mortars. Later this evening we start putting people ashore in landing craft. Basically, we can beach the ship and put stuff ashore directly through the ship's bows. We open the front end and drive stuff onto the beach. But by and large, because of other considerations, we use other landing craft to operate with us. And there we use two types. There's naval landing craft, the landing craft heavy, and also the Army LCM-8s, which is smaller than the naval landing craft.
As we come around crosswind, I'll give you control of the aircraft, and from then on, we'll be in a simulated position of a stuck tail rotor.
Rightio.
And from there you can just play it. Okay. Just tell me what you're looking for and what you think your recovery actions are going to be when we get back to the airfield. Righto, rolling out there now. Okay, come on the controls.
Okay, I have control.
Righto, you have control. I've got the tail rotor pedals.
Roger.
Now, just bear in mind, well, you're looking for a left yaw situation, so what are you going to do with the throttle when you come round to straighten the aircraft?
Okay, to straighten the aircraft. If I slowly wind the throttle off,
yep,
she should straighten up.
Okay,
If I
fine.
get it straight, I'll be putting it on the ground.
Okay, fine. Right, just hold that speed. That's nice. Just hold it until we come over the landing area. Okay, just nose over a little bit with the cyclic to keep that speed up. That's good. Righto.
Okay, just about in my landing area.
Okay.
Throttle is coming
Just
Oh.
come down a little bit, okay, just start. Winding the throttle off there now. That's it, stand by. And you're on the ground. Good one. Cancel the horn, and throttle fully closed.
In all areas of aviation, the instructor and the student develop a unique relationship. In the Fleet Air Arm, that's perhaps not so different, except that I believe that our instructors are amongst the best in the world. We have a close relationship with the Central Flying School in the United Kingdom, where our instructors are taught, and they come out from time to time and check our instructors out to make sure we're following current standards. So I believe we've got good instructors, in fact the best available today, and that these guys take it upon themselves to train naval aviators to the highest possible standard.
We're simulating that we've lost tail rotor altogether. Okay, you ready? Yep. Here we go. Just follow me through. Okay, there it is. Starting to turn there now. Try and hold your ground position. Now, you've assessed of what's going on. All you've got hold of now is you can grab hold of the throttle and just start winding the throttle back slowly. There you are. We're coming back into the dead throttle range there now. There we are. Starting to slow down, starting to slow down, starting to slow down. Just watch it there, watch it there. Righto, we're looking for it, looking for it. Probably hear the horn coming as the revs start to die off. There we go. Stand by and on the ground.
Pay attention this way, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get on with the debrief for exercise Canopus. On the screen in front of you, you see the situation at game start. The friendly forces in the middle of the picture are heading northeast, and friendly aircraft gained a detection shortly after game start on enemy surface units to the northeast at a range of approximately 20 miles. Reporting AD, has enemy radar been reported?
These training activities, mainly the Submarine Warfare Systems Centre and the Surface Warfare School, train people at 3 levels.
Right, the intention is to do another all-round look, then I'll check the firing bearing and fire.
Firstly, the basic level, and then an advanced level, and finally we take ship or submarine command teams and train them up to a level of proficiency before they go to sea for trials or operations.
Yemen, Captain.
By its very nature, naval operations at sea are risky, and so the purpose of these training facilities we have here, particularly the simulators we have, is to bring command teams up to a level of proficiency that makes it safe for them to proceed to sea and get going with their training.
Right, team, I have one ship in flight, which is an FFG, and a bow red flies.
The submarine simulator is a tactical trainer, and its primary role is to teach people the use of the combat system in the submarine and the control system. the trainees are able to see visually as they would see through a periscope, and at the same time you have the console for the submarine combat system for the torpedo and subsurface fired missiles.
2, 1, fire! 2-2 fired! 3-2 fired! 4-2 fired! 5-2 fired! 6-2 fired! 1-2 fired, we're hitting! Away!
In the tactical trainer building, we have 3 ship models which very closely resemble operations rooms of ships at sea.
I intend to take the right hand of the 2 targets, if it ever
Now,
comes to it.
in this way, this is quite different to the submarine side of things because it's most important for ships at sea to be constantly cooperating with other ships and with aircraft. And that simulator is designed to enable us to take teams up to a fairly high level of tactical training. When we have, say, 3 command teams closed up playing a tactical game in the tactical trainer building, we have a large number of other people who are in cubicles which might be driving aircraft, helicopters, submarines, or other ships. So for a fully fledged tactical game in that facility requires a very large number of people to be involved.
5 speed, 1-2. Unknown, 0-3.
This is Bravo Foxtrot, roger out.
Look at Australia, look at a map, look at the blue water that we have surrounding us, look at the distances we have to travel, look at the range of weather conditions that we have to deal with, and my answer is yes, we do need a blue water navy. And to me, a blue water navy is not just destroyers. A blue water navy is the submarines we need for surveillance, intelligence gathering, interdiction. A blue water navy are the surface ships we need for policing the economic zone, for protecting our sea lines of communication, not only in focal areas around the coast, but sometimes at extended distances out into the deep ocean. We need those surface ships to display a presence in the areas around us, in the Southwest Pacific, in Southeast Asia, to back up the diplomatic initiatives that the government wants to take, to demonstrate to people that Australia is a country that can provide a secure environment for these new nations that we see around us. I think the Navy that we have in being today is reasonably balanced. There are some weaknesses that we are plugging, but when you look at the threat that faces it, I think we have a well-balanced Navy, and within the resources that I see available to us, I see no reason why we shouldn't continue to develop and maintain that Navy.
The Bass Strait patrols, performed by Fremantle-class patrol boats, are among the most important of all RAN duties.
The whole operation is called Bass Strait Oil Rig Surveillance, and the duty of the patrol boat who's on duty during that time is to maintain a vigilance to prevent merchant ships from straying into the area around the oil fields in case that one should have an accident by colliding with an oil rig. Also, it's to keep yachts and small fishing craft and pleasure craft outside a distance of 500 metres from the oil rigs. Well, if you have a look at the weather today, this is the exception rather than the rule. On a 2 weeks patrol in area Bass in Bass Strait, you could look at probably a maximum of 3 days of calm weather like this, with the majority of the weather being in excess of 2 metres. 2 to 3 metres, and the whole problem with the weather down in Bass Strait is it funnels up between Tasmania and Cape Otway, and the weather can change completely in about a 2-hour period. So right now we've got a nice flat sea. In 2 hours time we could have anything up to 6 or 7 metres of sea and 40 to 60 knots of wind.
You find when it's really rough that you're walking along passageways, guys are sleeping up on the deck above us. It's a little bit more comfortable there. You don't feel the rocking and the waving as much, so they sort of curl up into little holes that they can find.
The patrol boats are programmed to spend most of their time around the coast, not just in the southern areas. We do spend a fair bit of time in the Barrier Reef and northern areas of Australia, and occasionally we do get to overseas ports. The broad spectrum of tasks that we are asked to do ensures that we do spend a fair bit of time away from our home port and other places in Australia. I've come from mainly big ships, and it is a different sort of life in the small ships, much closer knit sort of life with the crew than you'd have in a larger vessel. As you can imagine, with the fairly cramped conditions that we have on board the ship, tempers do tend to fray a little. However, that depends on the crew and how they get on themselves. It's very much a personality sort of thing.
After World War II, the decision was made for the RAN to acquire 2 aircraft carriers. And with the commissioning of HMAS Sydney in 1948, the RAN was no longer designated a squadron, she was a fleet. In 1951, Sydney was committed to the Korean conflict. The fledgling RAN Fleet Air Arm was to learn its skills in the hardest school of all, war.
We did do a great deal of flying. We had 4 squadrons on board. It was winter when we did the cruise, and the ship was covered in snow and ice, and I understand that if you went in the water there, none of us did, that you only had 4 or 5 minutes before you were close to death. As I say, we flew hard, but you flew hard for short periods.
Landing an aircraft on Sydney with her straight deck was a hazardous business.
You couldn't see very much for 2 reasons. First of all, it had a great big long nose and a propeller disc going in front of you. And in fact, you could hardly see the ship at all on your final approach. And so you, just like a World War I fellow, you pulled your goggles down over your eyes and leaned out in the slipstream, and you could see the batsman, and the batsman gave you the instructions until the very last second, and then you could see the deck. If there was any sort of sea running, the back end of the deck could be going up and down 30, 40 feet. But because that's where the batsman could help you. You tried to ignore that when you saw it at the last minute. He got the feel of when the ship was going to steady for a while, and then hopefully it cut you at the right moment and you came on. Well, it wasn't exactly frightening. Exciting is closer to the word. In those days with the straight deck, which the early, and the Sydney of course was a straight deck, you had to have these great big barriers up in front to prevent a fellow who missed the wires with his hook running into the aircraft that were already landed on, parked up forward. So if you missed the wires, you went into the fence, and it was fairly damaging to the aircraft, expensive noises. But very rarely the pilot got hurt. And of course there was the odd fellow who went over the side, caught a wire and went over the side, and sometimes even hit the back end of the ship before he got on. I can't remember what the accident rate was, but at one stage it was pretty horrific. I think something like 1 in 10 landings was an accident of some sort. I was often asked how I got bald at a fairly young age, and the answer was quite simple. I said I lost 1 hair for every deck landing I did, but 6 for every one I watched, because they were far worse to watch than they were to do, I think.
In 1955, the RAN took delivery of HMAS Melbourne. With her angled flight deck and steam catapult, she was to become the pride of the RAN for years to come.
It was a very fortuitous time for Australia. For example, there were these Majestic class light fleet carriers that were partially built in the UK. There were a number of Sea Fury fighters and Firefly aircraft which were obtainable at a reasonable price. There was, from the aircrew point of view, there were a number of ex-RAF chaps who'd flown in World War II who were keen to join this new Fleet Air Arm. There were some New Zealand chaps and some Royal Naval chaps. So all these circumstances all melded together to make it just about the right situation at the right time.
The RAN quickly acquired the skills to operate Melbourne to peak efficiency. Manoeuvring at sea under operational conditions required great care.
For flying operations, the carrier has a rescue destroyer known as the RESDES. RESDES is ahead of the carrier for launch. That way, using just red lights on its yard arm, it acts as a stable horizon for the aircraft taking off. Now, for land-ons, the RESDES then goes onto the quarter, the stern but slightly to one side of the carrier. So if there is a series of operations going where aircraft are taking off and then landing, the RESDES has to move. Now, at the time when this is happening, quite often ships are altering course, you may be in a formation, so the RESDES really has to know where he's going and what the carrier is doing.
In 1964, after years of safe operations, Melbourne was involved in the worst peacetime disaster in RAN history. During nighttime exercises, Melbourne collided with her RESDES destroyer, HMAS Voyager.
And suddenly I became aware that, that Melbourne appeared relative to us to be closing fairly fast, and I became aware that this was a collision course, and watched with horror over the last perhaps 30 seconds as a collision became inevitable out of the still night from Voyager's bridge. The cry just a little prior to impact was collision stations, and the collision occurred. Melbourne cut straight through Voyager as Voyager came across her bows. There were small fires as she would slice straight through. A lot of steam appeared, and of course Voyager heeled very hard over to starboard to an angle perhaps of 30 degrees. So I wasn't quite sure that the ship wasn't going to roll right over. I suppose my first thought was that I'll have to swim, and very stupidly I discarded my shoes at the time. Not a very brave act. She subsequently righted herself, and thereafter I had quite a lot to do and actually regretted not having shoes. Of course, the first action that was apparent to us was to release the engine room crew from the forward engine room. The superstructure was down in that area, and there was a certain amount of distortion, and with some bars, and we managed to prise open the door to the watertight door to the engine room, and release the crew from there.
"82 men of Voyager's crew of 293 were lost in a tragedy that profoundly shocked the nation and the RAN. In 1969, a similar disaster occurred during exercises with the United States Navy in the South China Sea. This time, Melbourne collided with the American destroyer Frankie Evans. 74 American sailors were killed.
The particular night in question, I'd been on watch, went down to my cabin. I'd been down there for about an hour or so, I suppose, and I just got this premonition that something seemed to be wrong. Got out of bed, got dressed, went out of my cabin, went back into the cabin and picked up diving knife and a belt that I wear when I'm diving that had a strobe light and a few other things on it. Headed down the quarterdeck and said to the lifebuoy sentry, "What's going on?" And he said, "Nothing." And just then was when the first alarms went through the ship for collision stations. That was the first broadcast of it. So, Sixth Sense, I gather, I must have picked it up from that. The stern section went down the starboard side of the Melbourne. The bow went over the port side of the Melbourne. There were people thrown off the upper deck of the destroyer, and also life rafts being dropped. Melbourne, of course, at this stage was going full astern, and there was a reasonable amount of confusion on the destroyer, to say the least, because it was cut cleanly in half. Life raft was thrown into the water, but there were a few people in the water, so I just jumped over the stern of the Melbourne and went swimming and gave assistance to them, putting them in life rafts and that, and eventually I stopped in one life raft with a chap who was quite badly injured, till we were picked up by a boat from the New Zealand frigate Waikato.
The RAN continued to operate Melbourne to the very limits of her capabilities.
Starting to turn a little, keep that right turn in. Okay, you're starting to level off now. A little bit more power on the aircraft.
To land the fast and heavy A4 Skyhawk on such a small carrier was exciting, to say the least.
Well, that was just about second up to being shot at for the first time. When you sit on the ground and think about what's going to happen, you think that it'll all happen in a sensible, gradual fashion. But the first landing on Melbourne was over and done with before I realised where you were. It was an amazing sensation. After you landed on doing your qualifications, you got on, we were marshalled up to the catapult, and that's sort of like 0 to 150 mile an hour in 2 seconds, and as the United States Navy said, we just don't give the keys to anybody, and there's been a lot of statements by naval aviators about that first cat shot, and I'd have to agree with them.
They say that going up the cat shot, if you had a sideshow like this at Luna Park, it would make an absolute fortune. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Melbourne was a very capable ship for its age. We operated it to its limits, there's no doubt about that. The aircraft we were operating off Melbourne were the biggest aircraft you could fit onto the carrier. You just couldn't fit anything, tracker-wise, wingspan and Skyhawk-wise in all-up weight. It was an enormous sense of pride to us to operate those aircraft off the carrier. We were competitive with the Americans, whom we spent obviously a lot of our time operating with, and of course you get that great pride when Americans would look at Melbourne and comment on how can you guys land on that little weeny goddamn ship. That gives you that sort of sense of pride.
In 1965, the RAN was again at war, this time in Vietnam. HMAS Sydney, the Vung Tau ferry, was now being used as a troop transport, landing Australian troops and their equipment in South Vietnam. RAN destroyers, operating with the Americans, became part of the gun line providing fire support for ground forces.
We had two basic roles in the Tonkin Gulf. One was for naval gunfire support, supporting the ARVN troops and the US Marine Corps south of the demilitarized zone. And then we went on the interdiction role in the Sea Dragon operation north of the demilitarized zone.
600, all right, for that being 726, 4800. Okay, this is the same as flight low.
I don't think one remembers the tiredness of it, because we'd go out for 2 to 3 weeks at a period. The Sea Dragon operations were the most demanding because we were subjected to counter-battery fire because obviously our work was quite effective. And yes, we worked long hours. We would probably shoot at 3 targets during the day and 3 at night. So when too many people on board got a great deal of sleep, and CO1 possibly got less than anybody else.
But if you took the advantage of having a 5 or 10 minute cat nap, you can last quite a long time. We've gained a great deal of confidence in the ship from her performance during the shakedown. And then to put that training experience together with these modern weapon systems into action in an actual combat situation, of course, and achieving good results, knowing that your guns were going to shoot accurately at long range, is a tremendous confidence builder in a ship's company. It gives you something which you can never get any other way, unfortunately. And consequently, your job satisfaction, in modern day terms, is very high.
In the air, the RAN was asked to supply a helicopter flight for support of ground operations. The RAN pilots and crew became part of the US Army's 135th Assault Helicopter Company.
We were in the front line every day, just about. We worked 7 days a week, all through the year. And wherever the action was natural that we would be involved in it, since we were taking the infantry to where their objectives were, and if there's anybody there, we were involved in it.
It was quite an amazing sensation to walk from known places here in Nowra onto a Qantas 707 and step out into the steamy conditions in Tonsanut and Saigon to be therefore then picked up again and taken out to our air base, which we operated from, which was the Thai Division headquarters. If that transition wasn't bad enough, virtually the next day you'd be co-piloting an aeroplane in a formation of 10 troop-carrying aircraft, accompanied by 4 gunships and a command and control aeroplane, carrying soldiers down in the Mekong Delta. Then, quick as a flash, people will be starting shooting and you'd start to realise, holy smoke, this is a shooting war out here. And the realisation of that suddenly sinks in and it really gives you some motivation, I'll tell you.
By 1985, HMAS Melbourne had reached the end of her useful life. Few other ships in RAN history had been regarded with greater affection than this grand old carrier.
I was fairly well devastated, to be quite honest. I know it's a silly emotion. It was an old ship. It had served its life, but it's very hard to spend the best part of 20 years flying on and off something like Melbourne and not feel an intense emotion for it. I think I and probably all the other ex-Melbourne people got a perverse pleasure when she refused to go and gave everybody such a hard time while I was trying to tow it away. I think we were all probably secretly hoping she'd just roll over and sink rather than go from being made into razor blades. It really was a very sad moment for us.
The nature of naval operations has changed dramatically with the advent of new defence technology and changing strategic considerations. The modern warship is smaller, yet can deliver more punch and protective capability than ever before.
Now we operate in smaller task groups of usually sort of 3 or 4 destroyers as a group to undertake specific missions, and so that would give us about 3 destroyer task groups, and then the submarines would operate in forward areas, interdicting the enemy's lines of communications or outside his own bases for his major surface units.
The skills required to drive the modern warship are complex and varied. The electronic information and targeting devices and the sophisticated weapon systems employed not only mean a more effective ship, they mean that reaction time for the crew is critically short.
Range that. 11 minutes. Down.
These skills are acquired and maintained by constant exercising. Here, submarine Otway exercises with destroyers Canberra and Perth.
Taking, Baker 0263 with Perth. Perth to firm 0263.
The surface ships must detect the submarine and destroy it before they are sunk. A game played in deadly earnest.
Yeah, roger.
Officer Watch, Canberra left 090, connect.
On board Perth, the PWO, Principal Warfare Officer, must think quickly. He must sort and respond to a bewildering maze of incoming information, with no second chances.
Officer Watch, PWO, P3's just had a sinker, now at 090, 20,000 yards. We're dispatching a tip gang to investigate.
Yankee Juliet, my sonar contact now 08017 and 70, tracking a 170, speed 7 up.
Yankee Whiskey, roger. X-ray Lima, roger.
X-ray Lima.
Aircraft and helicopters deploying sonar are the first line of defence.
Okay, stand by to mark diff. Left full. Left full. Mark diff. Down. Roger.
Well, big in front of the XB2, sir.
Signal level 3 not in contact.
To the boards, panel, if you can see. Target set up. There's that. 384. Hat 144. Hello.
Secondary, left center bearing 165, left bearing 2800. Bearing going right.
Yeah, roger.
Officer Watch, Canberra right, 090, conduct narrow wing, base course 090, increase 20.
Coming right 090, speed 20, conduct narrow wing, base course 090. Override of Victor Starboard 090.
Bridge PWO, on to control, bridge conning.
3000.
PWO, roger, conduct narrow wing, base course 090.
That. 16 minutes. 94. Range 6,800 yards. That's a good range. Range 720. Set the manual solution. Roger.
Going out active snake, sir.
Best solution, sir, is 075 at 12 knots, sir.
030.
ARC 030, Officer Watch, come hard right, 1 and 2 are 0.
Roger, coming hard right, 120.
ARC 030, missile inbound.
Master Canberra, missile inbound, 030. Aye, sir.
Today we have seen what is a coordinated anti-submarine warfare action at its highest level, with the coordination between an Orion aircraft from the Air Force, between our own helicopters and with surface units. And as it happens, the Orion was the first to gain contact on a submarine at some distance from us. He was the scene of action commander and prosecuted that contact initially. We dispatched 2 helicopters to join him, and as they got there, because they were then a better vehicle to prosecute at close range, they took over the prosecution, and we, in company with Canberra, joined, and as we got in closer, they were able to relay information to us,
we fired our Ikara missiles from a long range, then obtained sonar contact, and at this moment we're holding off at a distance just outside his torpedo firing range, where he is being harassed by the helicopter and the Orion, and we're standing off prosecuting.
Over 75 years, the RAN has evolved into a compact yet powerful regional force, not only protecting Australian shores, but maintaining an Australian presence and goodwill in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And the wheels kick, and the wind song, and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking.
Next Saturday at 8, we'll present a graphic look at the turmoil in Chile. Chile hasta cuando. Stay with us now for the Irish RM.